Hey everybody, Pastor Tim here. And as you know, we've been looking at the book of Job at a Lift on Tuesday nights. I just wanted to put this short video together to keep us thinking about not just kind of understanding the book theoretically, but how do we apply it to our lives? How does it get us to think theologically, biblically, in a gospel-centered way? How does it help us to wrestle through some issues? So the first 11 verses of chapter 1, we talked about kind of God setting up the scenario where he is presenting Job as a righteous man, and then Satan basically says, if you stop blessing him, he'll curse you. And then from verses 12 to the end of chapter 1, God basically says, you can basically bring it at Job, you just can't take his life. And Satan does, and destroys his property, his family dies, there's just servants are dying, animals. I mean, it's just a terrible, terrible situation, obviously. So I want to bring up a couple questions that we started to bat around a little bit, but I want you just to be maybe thinking about these as you watch this video. So one thing we talked about is that when we looked at what happened from verses 12 to the end of the chapter, we kind of wrestled with the question, is that fair? Is that just? And we have to kind of get down to a heart and soul level when we think about that. So we're not just saying, yes, God's sovereign, he's just, he's totally righteous at all times. That could be a true fact, and it is a true fact, but at a visceral heart level, do we really believe that? Like, do we know it deep inside? And so I just want us to think about the questions of justice, and in particular, two things. The first thing is God taking the life of animals, and how does God think about animal life, or how does God think about the topic of animals? And that should press us to think about, if God made animals, loves animals. The end of Job, he basically brags on two of his creations, two of his animals. He uses animals on a regular basis to teach lessons, and the pictures of heaven and earth coming together at the end of all time, he uses animal pictures as part of that. The lion will lay down with the lamb, and the child will basically be near the adder or the viper or the snake, and it won't bite him. So he's using animals continually to paint pictures. And we know that when he made animals, they said they're good. He said of them, they are good. So I want us to think about the topic of how do we think about taking care of or interacting with animals. It may seem like a distant thing to you, but God has the right to take life and give life. And he does take the life of some animals here, and yet it's not because he's flippant about them. It's because he remains sovereign over all things. And so I just want us to think about, I want you to do some thinking about, how do you view God's animals, his creation, in light of the fact that he loves them and has created them. And then the second thing we talked about was the idea that Job's servants are killed and his family is killed other than his wife. And so how do we think about that? One thing I tried to emphasize was to say that we can look at this as Job's story, and all the people are kind of like actors in Job's story. But this is Job's story as we're reading it, but this is also all those other individual humans. They have a story. They had a story. They have a story. God doesn't destroy a random life and say, well, you're just a pawn in the game of some bigger thing I'm trying to do. God cares for each individual. And so when we see Job's family servants die, God's not saying, oh, I didn't really care about you. The end of their earthly life was exactly as God ordained for their lives, in light of their lives, in light of who God is, not just in light of what Job's life looked like. So that's a little bit kind of philosophical to think about, that God interweaves all these lives and stories together, and yet each life stands totally separate. And so when it comes to justice, we need to remember that as much as we see key people in the Bible, and we see important figures or celebrity figures in our own culture, every single person, it may be the most famous celebrity out there in Hollywood. We think like they're the centerpiece of this story that we're watching, but there are assistants, there are cooks, there are drivers, there are 10,000 people who are making that person's life possible to be what it is. And so just a reminder that every single person has a story in God's eyes. It's not just the most famous or the most well-known people, whether it's in our day and age today or at the time of Job. And so when we think about that, let us remember that God interacts with people as their stories are woven together, but also he interacts with them as individuals that have their own unique story that he is totally aware of and totally in control of. So those are some thoughts. We ended by talking about the fact that Job's final response is that naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job was able to be in a place, despite his deep despair and distress, which we see when he tears his robe and shaves his head. He's able to say, God's in charge of all things. He gives and he takes away, and I praise him regardless. What a challenge to us to say, do we feel that same way when challenges come, and especially when tragedies come into our lives? So there's some food for thought as we're moving through this next week. I encourage you to spend some time thinking and praying about Job's response and Job's situation, and how you might respond in a similar situation. So that's the end of chapter 1 from Job, and we'll continue studying in the days to come. All right, guys, take care.